The sharp crystalline crack of a champagne flute meeting the marble floor echoed through the grand ballroom, a sound like a gunshot in a room full of whispers. Kalia felt the cold splash of moat against her ankles, the fine vintage soaking instantly into the delicate gold lace of her gown. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her breath hitched in her throat as she looked down at the glittering shards scattered around her heels that cost more than her entire life used to. "Careful now," a voice drawled, dripping with a familiar predatory arrogance. "You wouldn't want to ruin that dress. Although we both know it's far too expensive for someone like you to actually own." Kalia looked up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Standing before her was Nathaniel Crowe, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his features twisted into the same condescending sneer that had once been her entire world. He looked exactly the same, wealthy, untouchable, and utterly cruel. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice betraying a tremor she hated. He stepped closer, invading her personal space with a practiced, domineering ease. He didn't see the woman who had rebuilt herself in the shadows of Seoul. He saw only the girl he had broken and discarded 3 years ago to chase a socialite rival. "I heard you'd crawled your way to Korea, Kalia, but I didn't think you'd have the audacity to gatecrash a gala of this caliber. Tell me, did you sneak in through the service entrance? Or are you just here as someone's charity case?" Kalia gripped her silk clutch, her knuckles turning white. Under the heavy fabric of her glove, her fingers brushed the cold, hard surface of her wedding ring. A diamond so large it felt like a weapon. Yet, even as the wife of the city's most dangerous underground king, she felt small. The ghost of the woman who had survived on tap water and desperation rose up to haunt her. The gold lace felt heavy, like armor that didn't quite fit the girl underneath. She looked at her reflection in the gilded mirrors. She was a vision of opulence, but Nathaniel's gaze acted like acid, stripping away the luxury until she felt naked and exposed. "I am a guest, Nathaniel," she said, her chin tilted up even as her hands rose instinctively to her chest in a defensive posture. She was caught in that agonizing space between the fear of her past and the dignity of her present. "Leave me alone." Nathaniel laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that drew the eyes of the surrounding elite. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her shoulder, a silent threat of contact. "A guest? In a dress like that? You were always a good liar, Kalia. But you're trembling. You know you don't belong here. You're still just that pathetic girl from the streets, wearing a mask of gold. Run along before I have security show you the door. You're embarrassing yourself." The silence of the penthouse was absolute, a heavy velvet quiet that only immense wealth could buy. High above the restless, neon-soaked streets of Seoul, the morning sun spilled across the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long golden fingers over the white marble and minimalist silk furnishings. Kalia stood in the center of the massive walk-in closet, her bare feet sinking into the plush charcoal carpet. The room was a cathedral of designer labels, rows of Chanel, Dior, and Hermès hanging like colorful soldiers in formation. Yet she found herself reaching for a simple cream-colored silk slip dress. It was an old habit, a lingering shadow from the years when she had to make one outfit last a week, when every cent was a battle for survival. Even now, surrounded by more luxury than she had ever dreamed of, she gravitated toward the understated, as if trying to remain invisible to a world that had once been so cruel to her. "You're doing it again, my love." The voice was low, a deep baritone that vibrated through the air like a cello note. Kalia didn't have to turn to know that Park Min-sik was standing in the doorway. He was already dressed for the day in a charcoal three-piece suit, the fabric perfectly molded to his broad shoulders. He looked every bit the underground king, commanding, dangerous, and devastatingly handsome. But when he looked at Kalia, the cold steel in his eyes melted into something so tender it was almost painful. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco following him. He slid his hands around her waist, his palms warm through the thin silk of her dress. "Doing what?" Kalia whispered, leaning back against his chest. "Choosing the most modest thing in the room," Min-sik murmured, his lips brushing the sensitive skin of her neck. "You are the wife of the man who owns this city. You don't have to shop in your own closet like you're on a budget." Kalia let out a soft laugh, her fingers reaching up to cover his hands. I like simple things, Minseek. You know that. I like spoiling you, he countered, his grip tightening just a fraction, a possessive reflex she had grown to love. Humor me. Wear the pearls I bought you in London. And take the black card. I want you to buy anything that catches your eye today. He turned her around in his arms, his expression growing serious. This was the obsessive side of his protection, the part of him that treated her like a rare, fragile glass sculpture that might shatter if the wind blew too hard. You're going to the charity gala this evening. I won't be able to join you until later. I'll be fine, she assured him, though she felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. You're not going alone, he said, his voice dropping an octave, the king emerging from the husband. Ji-hoon and the rest of the security detail will be with you. They will maintain a discreet distance, but they are not to leave your side. Not for a second. Minseek, it's a charity gala for the school, she protested gently. I don't need an army. You need whatever I say you need, he said, his jaw tightening. It was non-negotiable. He knew the enemies he had made to build his empire, and he knew that she was his only true weakness, the one piece of his heart he had left exposed. He cupped her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with reverent care. I spent too long searching for someone like you to let anything happen to you now. You are my peace, Kalia, and I will burn this city to the ground to keep that peace intact. He kissed her then, a deep, thorough kiss that tasted of devotion and a simmering protective fire. When he finally pulled away, he checked his platinum watch, a simple piece that cost more than a suburban home. I have a meeting with the district heads, he said, his eyes lingering on her one last time. I'll be home by 7. We'll go to the gala together after I finish. Wear the gold dress, Kalia, the one that makes you look like the queen you are. As he walked away, his stride full of predatory grace, Kalia watched him go, a mix of awe and lingering fear swirling in her chest. She was safe now, cocooned in a world of marble and silk, protected by a man the world feared. But as she looked at the gold dress hanging in the corner, the one she would eventually wear to face Nathaniel Crow, she wondered if even the king's peace could truly silence the ghosts of her past. The evening air of Seoul was crisp, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the penthouse. Kalia stood before the full-length mirror one last time, the gold lace of her gown shimmering like liquid fire under the recessed lighting. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, hugging every curve with a precision that felt more like armor than silk. Minseek had been right. The color looked divine against her skin, but as she adjusted the heavy diamond studs in her ears, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was masquerading as someone she wasn't. She reached for her clutch, checking for the heavy, metallic weight of the black card Minseek had insisted she carry. Beside it lay her phone, already buzzing with a check-in text from her husband. Ji-hoon is downstairs. Stay close to him. I will see you soon, my queen. Kalia took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric over her hips. Tonight was supposed to be a triumph for the international school where she taught. As the head of the English department and a key liaison for their charity initiatives, she was representing the institution's heart. It was a role she had earned through sheer brilliance and hard work, a far cry from the charity case Nathaniel had once branded her. The descent to the lobby was a silent, choreographed movement of power. Ji-hoon was waiting by the black armored SUV, his expression unreadable, his suit as sharp as the lethal intent he carried. He bowed deeply as Kalia approached, holding the door open with a level of reverence that still felt surreal to her. Two other men, faces stony and eyes constantly scanning the perimeter, waited in a secondary vehicle. Minseek's protection was a silent, suffocating shadow, a reminder that while she walked in the light, she was tethered to the king of the dark. The drive through the neon-lit streets of Gangnam was a blur of high-rise glass and glowing advertisements. When they arrived at the Grand Hyatt, the spectacle was overwhelming. A red carpet rolled out like a tongue of velvet toward the entrance, flanked by photographers and the city's most elite. Kalia felt the familiar tighten in her chest, the instinct to shrink, to hide, to apologize for taking up space. But then she felt the weight of the diamond on her finger, and she remembered the man who had placed it there. "Ma'am," Ji-hoon murmured, stepping out to flank her as she exited the car. "We are here. Remember, we are right behind you." Kalia stepped onto the carpet, her head held high. The flashbulbs were a dizzying white strobe, but she moved with a grace that felt practiced. Inside, the ballroom was a cathedral of opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain from the vaulted ceilings, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged scotch. This was the world she now inhabited, a world where names were weapons and silence was a luxury. She moved through the crowd, accepting polite nods and filtered smiles from the board members and wealthy parents of her students. To them, she was Mrs. Park, the elegant, mysterious wife of a man whose business interests were as vast as they were vaguely defined. They didn't know about the car she had slept in or the nights she had cried over a bank balance of $17. She was playing the part perfectly until she reached the main dais near the stage. "Kalia, you look absolutely stunning," the school's principal, Dr. Aris, exclaimed, leaning in for a brief air kiss. "We are so thrilled with the turnout. And wait until you hear the news. Our primary donor for the new arts wing flew in personally from the States to deliver the keynote. It's a massive coup for the school." Kalia smiled, though a cold prickle of unease began to stir at the back of her neck. "That's wonderful, Dr. Aris. Who is it?" "A real visionary. Crow Investments. Apparently, he's looking to expand his philanthropic footprint in Asia." The name hit Kalia like a physical blow. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Crow. It couldn't be. Nathaniel's interests were in tech and real estate. He had never cared about education unless it was a tax write-off. "Is something wrong, Kalia?" Dr. Aris asked, noticing the way her hand tightened around her champagne flute. "No," Kalia whispered, her voice sounding far away to her own ears. I didn't realize we were looking so far abroad for funding. Well, he's a guest of honor tonight. Look, the ceremony is starting." The lights dimmed and a spotlight cut through the darkness, centering on the grand stage. The school's logo projected onto the screen, followed by a series of slides detailing the new construction projects. Kalia stood frozen, her eyes glued to the stage, her heart a drumbeat of impending doom. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, his voice booming through the high-fidelity speakers. "Please join me in welcoming a man whose commitment to global excellence is matched only by his success in the boardroom. From the United States, our guest of honor, Mr. Nathaniel Crow." The applause was thunderous. Kalia watched as a man stepped out from the wings, his stride arrogant and familiar. He was dressed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than her first year's salary as a teacher. He moved to the podium with a smug, practiced ease, adjusting the microphone before looking out over the crowd with the eyes of a shark. Kalia wanted to run. She wanted to turn and find Jihoon, to tell him they needed to leave, to disappear back into the safety of Minseek's penthouse. But she was the representative of the school. She was a woman of standing. And as Nathaniel's gaze swept across the room, it eventually landed on her. For a second, his polished philanthropist mask slipped. His eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his features as he took in the woman in the gold dress. But the shock was quickly replaced by something uglier. A slow, creeping contempt. He didn't see the educator. He didn't see the wife of a king. He saw the girl he had discarded. He leaned into the microphone, his eyes locked onto hers, a cruel smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's truly a pleasure to be here in Seoul," Nathaniel began, his voice dripping with a subtle mocking undertone. "I've always believed that charity starts with those who are truly in need. And looking around this room, I see that some people have certainly managed to find very generous benefactors." The insult was veiled, hidden beneath the polite veneer of a speech, but Kalia felt it like a slap. She stood there, caught in the spotlight of her past, while the man who had destroyed her began to take credit for the future she had worked so hard to build. The gold dress she had felt so beautiful in moments ago suddenly felt like a lie, a costume for a charity case who had simply found a bigger wallet. She looked toward the back of the room, searching for the shadow of Minseek's men. Knowing that the piece she had found was about to be shattered by the ghost, she had never truly escaped. The applause for Nathaniel's speech was a roar that felt like a physical weight, pressing against Kalia's eardrums until her head throbbed. As the house lights began to rise, she saw him step away from the podium, his hand lingering on the wood with the casual possessiveness of a man who believed he owned every room he entered. He began to descend the stairs, shaking hands with board members and laughing with the very people Kalia had spent months convincing to care about her students. She couldn't stay here. The gold lace of her gown, once a shimmering testament to her rebirth, now felt like a gilded cage. Every eye that turned toward her felt like a judge, searching for the charity case Nathaniel had so expertly alluded to. She turned, her movements stiff and mechanical, and began to weave through the clusters of tuxedoed men and silk-clad women toward the high-arched exits leading to the terrace. She nearly made it to the cool, midnight air of the balcony when a dark shadow stepped into her path. Going somewhere so soon, Kalia? The night is just beginning. Nathaniel stood between her and the glass doors, a flute of champagne in one hand and the other tucked into his trouser pocket. He moved with a practiced predatory grace, shifting his weight just enough to ensure that whichever way she turned, he was there. A solid, immovable wall of the past. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "Move aside. I'm going out for air." He didn't move. Instead, he leaned in, his eyes raking over her with a clinical, mocking intensity that made her skin crawl. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving her face. "You've certainly learned how to play the part," he drawled, his voice a low, private hiss underneath the swell of the orchestra's music. "The hair, the diamonds, the way you hold that glass. It's almost convincing. If I didn't know exactly what was underneath all that gold leaf." "You don't know anything about me anymore," Kalia snapped, her chin lifting in a desperate attempt to reclaim the sovereignty Minseek had spent months building within her. Nathaniel let out a sharp, dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He reached out, his hand moving with a suddenness that made her flinch. He didn't touch her skin, but he caught the heavy, intricate lace of her sleeve between his thumb and forefinger, rubbing the fabric as if testing its quality. "I know this dress costs more than your father made in a decade. I know those earrings are worth a small apartment. And I know you didn't pay for a single thread of it." He stepped closer, invading the small pocket of space she had left. The scent of his expensive cologne, the same one he'd worn the night he told her she was a parasitic weight on his life, hit her like a wave of nausea. "It's pathetic, really. You're still just a charity case, Kalia. You've just traded a billionaire who is tired of you for whatever local thug is footing the bill this week. Is that what this is? A makeover for the help? I am the head of a department at an international institution, Nathaniel. I am a wife. I am more than you ever let me be," she whispered, though her hands were beginning to tremble. She looked past him, searching for Jihoon's familiar stony silhouette, but the crowd had shifted, and she was momentarily isolated in this gilded alcove. Nathaniel's eyes darkened, his lip curling into a sneer that stripped away the last of his public charm. "You're a fraud. You're standing here in a room full of real power, wearing a costume that belongs to a queen, while you're still the same desperate girl who begged me not to leave. You can wear all the gold in the world, Kalia, but it won't hide the smell of poverty on your soul." He shifted his body, physically pinning her against the marble pillar of the doorway. He was blocking her exit, his posture domineering and aggressive, a stark contrast to the elegant woman caught in the center of his contempt. "Tell me," he whispered, his face inches from hers, "does your husband know he's just buying a used, broken thing? Or did you lie to him about your past the way you're lying to everyone in this ballroom?" Kalia's heart was a trapped bird, battering itself against her ribs. She was caught between the instinct to shrink, the old familiar urge to apologize for her existence, and the rising cold fury of a woman who had been loved by a king. She felt the diamond wedding ring beneath her glove, a cold promise of a power Nathaniel couldn't possibly understand. "You think you're so high above me," she said, her voice gaining a sudden icy clarity. "But you're the one standing in a room you didn't build, Nathaniel. You're the one who has to insult a woman to feel like a man. My husband doesn't just pay my bills. He owns the very air you're breathing right now. And if I were you, I'd be very careful about how much of it you use to insult his wife." Nathaniel's sneer didn't waver, but a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, crossed his features before his arrogance surged back. "Threats? How quaint. You really have gone native, haven't you? Let's see how long your protector lasts when the real security realizes you're a gatecrasher. He didn't move, his body still a barrier between her and the light, his contempt a suffocating shroud. Kalia looked at him, truly looked at him, and realized that while she was wearing gold, he was the one who was hollow. But the fear remained, a bitter taste in the back of her throat, as she waited for the moment the shadow of her past would finally be eclipsed by the shadow of her husband. Nathaniel's presence was a physical weight, a remnant of a past life that Kalia had tried so desperately to bury under layers of silk and marble. He stayed rooted in place, his body a barrier that smelled of expensive scotch and unearned confidence. His eyes narrowed as if he were trying to find the cracks in her gold-leafed armor. He was so convinced of his own dominance that he didn't notice the sudden change in the ballroom's atmosphere. He didn't see the way the light seemed to dim at the edges of the alcove, or how the surrounding guests were quietly, instinctively drifting away, sensing a predator in the water. But Kalia felt it. It was a coldness that didn't come from the air conditioning, but from a familiar lethal efficiency that followed her husband like a shadow. Behind Nathaniel's left shoulder, a man appeared out of the crowd. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He simply materialized. Ji-hoon stood perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his face a mask of carved stone. Two other men, equally silent and dressed in identical razor-sharp black suits, positioned themselves at the other exits of the alcove. They didn't reach for weapons, but their posture, the slight cant of their shoulders, the way their eyes scanned Nathaniel's vitals, made the billionaire's aggressive stance look like a child playing with fire. "You really should have stayed in the States, Nathaniel," Kalia said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like ice. "Why?" "Because you've found some local muscle to keep the riffraff away." Nathaniel sneered, glancing over his shoulder with a dismissive flick of his eyes. He saw Ji-hoon, but he only saw a servant. He saw a suit. He didn't see the man who had survived 3 turf wars before he was 25. "I've dealt with security guards before, Kalia. They're all the same. They work for the highest bidder. Maybe I'll offer them double whatever your boyfriend is paying to just walk away, and let us finish our conversation." Ji-hoon didn't blink. He didn't even acknowledge Nathaniel's existence. His eyes remained fixed on Kalia, waiting for the only signal that mattered. Suddenly, Kalia's silk clutch vibrated. The sound was a low rhythmic hum that seemed to cut through the swell of the orchestra music. Nathaniel's lip curled. "Go ahead. Answer it. Is it him? Is it the king calling to make sure his investment hasn't run away?" Kalia's fingers were steady as she reached into the bag and pulled out the slim, obsidian-colored phone. The screen didn't show a number, only a single stylized character that meant protection. She pressed the phone to her ear. The ballroom seemed to go silent. It wasn't that the music had stopped, but rather that the gravity in the room had shifted, centering entirely on the small device in Kalia's hand. "Minseek," she said softly. "Are you hurt?" The voice was a low, deadly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. It wasn't a question asked out of worry. It was a question asked to determine the level of wreckage that would follow. It was so loud, so resonant that Nathaniel, standing inches away, heard the cold edge of it. The color began to drain from his face, his smug expression flickering like a dying candle. "I'm fine," Kalia replied, her eyes locked onto Nathaniel's. "But Mr. Crow is having trouble finding the exit. Put him on speaker." The command was absolute. Kalia slowly lowered the phone, her thumb grazing the screen. The voice that emerged from the device was no longer just a baritone. It was the sound of a city's judgment. "Mr. Crow," Minseek's voice filled the alcove, cold and eerily calm. "You are currently standing in a building I own, breathing air I allow you to have, and speaking to the only thing in this world I value more than my own life. My security team is currently counting the seconds until I give them a reason to stop being polite. I suggest you use those seconds to remember what it feels like to walk on your own 2 feet, because if you are still in my wife's presence when my car reaches the front gates, you will never walk again." The line went dead. The silence that followed was absolute. Nathaniel stood frozen, his hand still holding his champagne flute, but the glass was trembling so violently that the liquid began to slosh over the rim. He looked at Ji-hoon, and for the first time he saw the death in the man's eyes. He looked at the two enforcers flanking the doors, and he realized they weren't there to protect Kalia from him. They were there to hold him in place until the king arrived to finish him. The charity case was gone. In her place stood a woman backed by an empire of shadows, and Nathaniel Crow had just realized he was the one begging for mercy. The silence Nathaniel had left in the wake of the phone call was heavier than any sound the orchestra could produce. He stood paralyzed, the champagne flute in his hand rattling against his signet ring with a frantic metallic chatter. The liquid inside, the same vintage he had used to mock Kalia moments before, now seemed to mock him, sloshing over his trembling fingers. He looked at Ji-hoon, hoping to see a flicker of hesitation, but the security chief remained a statue of lethal intent, his gaze fixed on a point just past Nathaniel's ear, waiting for the arrival of his master. Outside the grand arched windows of the Hyatt, the night was suddenly pierced by a rhythmic mechanical thrum. It wasn't the sound of city traffic. It was the synchronized roar of a motorcade. A line of black armored sedans swept into the circular drive with the precision of a military strike, their headlights cutting through the gala's soft ambience like searchlights. The guests near the windows began to murmur, their curiosity quickly turning into a hushed, reverent dread. They knew that sound. They knew the weight of the air when the King of Seoul decided to claim a room. The massive oak doors of the ballroom didn't fly open. They were pulled wide by two waitstaff who bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the carpet. Park Min-sik stepped into the threshold, and the ballroom went cold. He didn't wear the flashy opulence of the men currently filling the room. He wore a midnight black overcoat over a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light of the crystal chandeliers. He didn't move with haste. His gait was a slow, deliberate prowl, the sound of his handmade Italian Oxford striking the marble floor with a terrifying rhythmic finality. Behind him, four more men in black suits followed in a disciplined diamond formation, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's focus. The reaction was instantaneous. Dr. Eris, the school board members, and the billionaires who had been laughing with Nathaniel only minutes ago didn't just move aside. They recoiled. Men who controlled half of Korea's tech industry instinctively lowered their heads, their spines curving into bows of deep, survivalist respect. This was not a business associate. This was the man who kept the engine of the city running in the dark. Min-sik ignored them all. He didn't look at the gala's displays or the expensive floral arrangements. His eyes were locked on the small gilded alcove where Kalia stood. As he approached, the crowd parted like a sea of silk and wool. The space around Nathaniel and Kalia became a vacuum. Nathaniel's breath hitched, a soft, pathetic wheeze as he realized that the local thug he had imagined was the man currently making the wealthiest people in the country tremble. He tried to take a step back, but his heel caught on the edge of a rug, and he stumbled, nearly falling against the marble pillar he had used to pin Kalia only moments before. Min-sik stopped 3 feet away. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a suppressed, violent energy. He stood perfectly still, his overcoat slightly parted to reveal the impeccable line of his waistcoat. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't even acknowledge Nathaniel's existence. He looked only at Kalia. His gaze traveled over her, taking in the gold lace of her dress, the diamonds at her ears, and finally, the faint, shimmering tracks of moisture on her cheeks. His jaw tightened, a sharp, angular movement that signaled a death sentence. "Kalia," he said, his voice a low, resonant purr that carried clearly through the silent room. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to cup her face with a gentleness that was jarring compared to the lethal aura he radiated. His thumb brushed over her cheek, wiping away the last of her fear. "I told you I would be here. Why are you standing in the dark?" "Min-sik," she whispered, her voice finally finding its strength. She leaned into his touch, the warmth of his hand anchoring her to the present, erasing the cold ghost of Nathaniel's contempt. Only then did Min-sik turn his head. It was a slow, mechanical movement, like a predator shifting its focus to a secondary, less significant prey. He looked at Nathaniel Crow, and the temperature in the alcove seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Min-sik's eyes were not angry. They were black and empty, the eyes of a man who had seen the end of many worlds and was currently deciding the fate of this one. Nathaniel tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. The billionaire who had spent his life branding others as charity cases was now the most pathetic thing in the room. A man stripped of his pride, his power and his breath, staring into the face of a king who was looking at him as if he were nothing more than a stain on the floor. "So," Minseek said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "this is the man who thinks my wife is a project. This is the man who thinks he can speak to a queen while standing in the dirt." He took one step closer to Nathaniel, and the billionaire's knees finally buckled. The air in the alcove was thick with a silence so heavy it felt tangible, a suffocating shroud that Nathaniel Crow was currently drowning in. Minseek didn't move, didn't breathe, his hand still cupping Kalia's face as if she were the only thing anchored to the earth. His dark eyes, usually as unreadable as the midnight sea, were now turbulent with a silent, terrifying promise of wreckage. "Tell me everything," Minseek murmured, his voice so low it was meant only for her, yet it carried the weight of an ultimatum. "Tell me why this ghost thinks he has the right to haunt you." Kalia took a ragged breath, the gold lace of her gown rustling against the marble pillar. She looked past Minseek's shoulder to where Nathaniel was being held in place by Jihoon's icy stare. The billionaire looked small now, his expensive tuxedo unable to hide the way his frame was beginning to collapse under the pressure of Minseek's presence. "He didn't just leave me, Minseek," Kalia began, her voice trembling before finding a hard, cold edge. "He waited until I had poured every ounce of my soul into the development of the algorithms that built Crow Investments. I was the one who designed the predictive models that made him a billionaire. I was the one who sat up until dawn while he slept, making sure his empire had a foundation." She looked into Minseek's eyes, seeing the dark fury beginning to ignite behind his pupils. "The day the patent was filed, the day his company went public, I came home to find the locks changed. He hadn't just ended our relationship, he had scrubbed my name from every legal document. He took my intellectual property, my savings, and the apartment I had paid for." The ballroom music seemed to fade into a distant hum as the memory of that night surfaced like a jagged blade. "I waited for him in the rain for 3 hours. When he finally came out, he didn't even look at me. He threw a handful of $20 bills at my feet and told me to get out of his sight. He called me trash. He told me I was a parasitic charity case who should be grateful he'd let me breathe his air for as long as he had." Kalia's fingers tightened on the lapel of Minseek's overcoat, her knuckles white. "He told me I was nothing without him, that no one would ever see me as anything but a broken thing looking for a handout. For 3 years, every time I looked in the mirror, I heard his voice telling me I was worthless. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence before a storm, the stillness of a city just before the earth opens up." Minseek didn't explode in rage. He became something much worse. He became still. His thumb traced the line of Kalia's jaw, his touch almost reverent, as if he were trying to heal the invisible scars Nathaniel's words had left behind. "Trash," Minseek repeated, the word sounding like a death knell in his throat. He turned his head slowly, finally acknowledging Nathaniel. The billionaire's knees hit the marble floor with a sickening thud, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of supplication. Minseek didn't look at him with hatred. He looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a man deciding how to dispose of a piece of refuse. "You stole her light to build your tower," Minseek said, his voice a low, resonant purr that chilled the very marrow of Nathaniel's bones. "You took her brilliance and called it your own, then had the audacity to call her a charity case when she was the one feeding your ambition." Minseek stepped back, pulling Kalia into the protective curve of his arm, his possessiveness now a physical shield. "Kalia is not a project, and she is certainly not a charity case. She is the woman who survived the wreckage you created and became a queen. And you, Mr. Crow, are about to learn that when you steal from a queen, the king does not just ask for restitution. He takes everything until you have nothing left but the dirt you tried to bury her in." Nathaniel tried to speak, but only a soft, broken whimper escaped his lips. Kalia watched him, and for the first time in 3 years, the voice in her head, the one that sounded like Nathaniel, went silent. She wasn't the girl in the rain anymore. She was Kalia Rue Sinclair, and her husband was about to show the world exactly what happened to anyone foolish enough to call his wife trash. The ballroom had become a tomb of gilded silence, the only sound the frantic, wet gasps of Nathaniel Crow as he collapsed further into himself on the marble floor. Minseek did not offer him the mercy of a look. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal waistcoat and withdrew a slim, obsidian-colored phone. The device seemed to hum with the same lethal potential as the men standing guard at the perimeter. Minseek's fingers moved with a terrifying rhythmic precision. He didn't dial. He simply tapped a single icon. When he spoke, his voice was devoid of heat, a low mechanical rasp that carried the weight of a final judgment. "It's time," Minseek said, switching to English so that every word would cut into Nathaniel like a scalpel. "Crow Investments. Execute the short position on the opening bell. Every share we hold, every derivative, dump it. And notify our partners in London and Tokyo. I want the market flooded before the board can even call an emergency session." He paused, his eyes fixed on the distant crystal chandeliers, as if he were watching the ticker tape of Nathaniel's life unravel in real time. "Also, send the forensic audit of the 2022 patent filings to the SEC and the international press. Let them see exactly whose brilliance bought those private jets." Nathaniel let out a broken, strangled cry, his fingers clawing at the air as if he could catch the falling shards of his reputation. "You can't. The board, my father." Minseek finally looked at him, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips, a smile that held no warmth. "Your father is exactly who I'm calling next, Nathaniel. I believe he values the Crow name far more than he values the son who stained it." He tapped the screen again. The wait was brief. When the voice on the other end answered, a voice Kalia recognized as the elder, more formidable Silas Crow, the air in the alcove seemed to freeze. Minseek placed the call on speaker, holding the phone out like a witness to a crime. "Silas," Minseek said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the destruction of a legacy. "I'm calling from Seoul. I believe your son has made a series of regrettable mistakes. He's currently at my feet, having insulted my wife and admitted to the theft of the very intellectual property that built your firm's current valuation." There was a long, agonizing silence from the other side of the world. Kalia could almost hear the gears of a dynasty shifting. "Mr. Kong," Silas Crow's voice came through, sounding old and brittle, yet sharp with the instinct for self-preservation. "What is your price?" "I don't have a price, Silas," Minseek replied, his thumb grazing Kalia's hand, a silent promise of absolute protection. "I have a requirement. By tomorrow morning, Nathaniel will be removed from every board seat, every trust, and every legal tie to the Crow name. He will issue a full public confession regarding the theft of Kalia Rue Sinclair's work. If he doesn't, I won't just ruin him. I will dismantle everything you've built over the last 40 years. I will make the Crow name a synonym for fraud in every market from New York to Hong Kong." "Father, no," Nathaniel shrieked, his voice cracking. "He's bluffing. He's just a—" "Shut up, Nathaniel," Silas snapped, the sound of a door slamming shut on a life of privilege. Then back to Minseek. "It will be done. Send the documentation to my legal team. He is dead to me." The line went dead with a final clinical click. Minseek tucked the phone back into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked down at the shivering wreck that was Nathaniel Crow, the man who had once called Kalia trash, the man who had stolen her future to buy his own. Nathaniel looked up, his eyes wide with a terror so deep it transcended words. He was no longer a billionaire. He was a ghost in an expensive suit, a man whose world had been liquidated with a single phone call. "You said she was nothing without you," Minseek whispered, leaning down so only Nathaniel could hear the finality of it. "But tonight you've learned the truth. You are nothing without the things you stole from her. And now I've taken them back." Minseek straightened, pulling Kalia closer to his side. He didn't wait for Nathaniel to respond. He didn't wait for the security guards to haul the broken man away. He simply turned, leading Kalia back through the ballroom. The elite of Seoul parted like the Red Sea, their heads bowed in a silent, terrifying acknowledgement of the power that had just been exercised. Kalia walked beside her husband, her head held high, the gold lace of her dress catching the light. For the first time in 3 years the weight was gone. The charity case had been buried under the wreckage of an empire, And in its place stood a woman who finally knew her own worth, and the lengths a king would go to defend it. The air in the grand ballroom, once heavy with the scent of lilies and old money, now hummed with a different frequency, the frantic staccato vibration of 1,000 smartphones receiving the same notification at once. It began as a ripple of hushed pings and chimes, a digital wildfire that swept through the rows of Seoul's elite faster than any rumor could travel. Heads that had been bowed in reverence to Minseek now tilted toward glowing screens, eyes widening as the first headlines from the international wires began to break. Nathaniel remained on the marble floor, a crumpled figure in a tuxedo that suddenly looked like a costume from a bygone era. He reached for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat, but the device was already a graveyard of his own making. The news was everywhere. Major outlets were running the forensic audit Minseek had leaked, the detailed, line-by-line evidence that proved the predictive algorithms of Crow Investments were not the work of a boy-wonder billionaire, but the stolen intellectual property of a woman he had discarded like refuse. Beside the fraud allegations were the testimonials. 3 other women, emboldened by the sudden shift in the tide, had come forward within minutes, their stories of financial and emotional abuse echoing Kalia's own. The narrative of the visionary philanthropist was being systematically dismantled, replaced by the ugly truth of a serial con artist who preyed on the brilliance of those he claimed to love. Nathaniel. The voice was like a shard of ice, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Jessica, the woman who had spent the evening draped in the arrogant pride of being Nathaniel's fiancée, stepped out from the shadows of the dais. Her face, usually a mask of polished socialite perfection, was now a portrait of cold, calculated fury. She looked down at the man on the floor, not with pity, but with the clinical disgust one reserved for a cockroach found in a high-end boutique. "Jessica, wait," Nathaniel wheezed, pushing himself up to his knees. He reached for the hem of her silk gown, his voice a desperate, pathetic rasp. "I can explain. It's a setup. This man, he's a criminal. He's manipulated the data." "The data doesn't lie, Nathaniel," Jessica interrupted, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the silent room. She stepped back, pulling her dress away from his touch as if his very fingertips carried a contagion. She held up her own phone, the screen displaying the public confession Silas Crow had just authorized. "Your father just issued a statement. You've been removed from the board. Your trust is frozen. You aren't a billionaire anymore. You're just a liability." She looked over at Kalia, her eyes scanning the gold lace of the woman she had mocked only an hour ago. For a fleeting second, a flicker of something resembling respect, or perhaps just the recognition of a superior power, passed between them. Jessica reached up, her movements slow and deliberate, and twisted the 4-carat diamond ring off her finger. Without a word, she dropped the ring. It hit the marble with a dull, hollow clatter, rolling until it came to a stop in the puddle of champagne Nathaniel had spilled earlier. "I don't marry charity cases," Jessica sneered, echoing the very insult Nathaniel had hurled at Kalia. "Security. Please remove this man. He isn't on the guest list." The irony was a physical blow. 2 Hyatt security guards, who had previously been falling over themselves to serve Nathaniel, stepped forward. They didn't offer the polite assistance given to a guest who had had too much to drink. They gripped him by the shoulders, hauling him to his feet with a rough, unceremonious efficiency. Nathaniel looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face, a single person who would stand by him. But there was nothing. The people who had laughed at his jokes and praised his vision were now looking away, their expressions filled with a collective social leprosy. He had been erased. In the eyes of the elite, he had ceased to exist the moment his bank balance hit zero. Kalia watched him being dragged toward the service entrance, the very door he had accused her of sneaking through. His eyes met hers one last time, wide, bloodshot, and filled with a realization so profound it seemed to shatter what was left of his mind. He wasn't the protagonist of his own story anymore. He was a footnote in hers. Minseek's arm tightened around Kalia, his presence a warm, immovable anchor amidst the wreckage of Nathaniel's life. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply turned her away from the sight of the falling man, leading her toward the main exit. As they walked through the ballroom, the crowd parted once more, But this time the bows were different. They weren't just for the king. They were for the queen who had survived the fire and returned with the power to burn down empires. Kalia held her head high, the weight of the past finally falling away like the gold lace of a dress that had served its purpose. She wasn't a charity case and she wasn't a victim. She was home. The drive back to the penthouse was a study in profound silence, the kind that follows a storm when the air is stripped of its humidity and everything feels sharper, clearer. Outside the tinted windows, the neon lights of Seoul blurred into long electric ribbons of violet and gold, a stark contrast to the darkness that had finally been lifted from Kalia's heart. Beside her, Min-sik held her hand, his thumb tracing slow, rhythmic circles on her palm. He didn't speak, but the weight of his presence was a vow kept, a solid anchor that reminded her the night's wreckage was not a dream. When they arrived at the penthouse, the staff had already been dismissed for the night. The massive living space was bathed in the soft, amber glow of the recessed lighting, the city skyline glittering through the glass like a sea of fallen stars. Kalia moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection in the glass catching the shimmer of the gold lace. It was the dress that had seen her through the fire. She reached up, her fingers trembling slightly as she began to unfasten the diamond studs from her ears, feeling the physical weight of the evening finally begin to settle. Min-sik appeared behind her, his reflection overlapping hers. He didn't wait for her to ask. He reached out, his large warm hands replacing hers at her ears. He removed the diamonds with the same reverent care he would use for a sacred relic, placing them on the nearby marble console. "The world is talking about you tonight," Min-sik murmured, his voice a low vibration against the back of her neck. "They are calling you a genius. They are calling you a survivor. But I want to know what you are calling yourself." Kalia turned in his arms, her head resting against the silk of his waistcoat. The scent of him, sandalwood and the cold, crisp air of the night, wrapped around her like a second skin. "I feel light," she whispered. "For 3 years I felt like I was walking through deep water, trying to reach a shore that Nathaniel kept moving further away. Tonight I think I finally touched land." Min-sik stepped back, but only to reach for a leather portfolio resting on the desk. He held it out to her, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes were dark with a quiet, fierce pride. "You touched land, Kalia. But I don't want you to just stand on it. I want you to own it." Kalia took the portfolio, the leather cool and heavy in her hands. She opened it to find a stack of legal documents, stamped with the official seal of the Seoul Metropolitan Government. As she scanned the lines of elegant Korean script and the English translations beneath, her breath hitched. It was a deed of absolute ownership for a historic 5-story stone building in the heart of Itaewon, a structure she had admired every time they drove past it, known for its ivy-covered walls and grand arched windows. "Min-sik, what is this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It is the foundation of your future," he replied, stepping closer until he was once again looming over her, a shield against the rest of the world. "Nathaniel tried to convince you that your voice was a charity case, something he could buy and discard. I want you to use his liquidated assets to ensure no other woman ever has to believe that lie." He turned the page to reveal the architectural renderings already drafted for the interior: bright, open spaces for legal advocacy, technology labs for women in STEM, and private counseling suites. At the top of the first page, embossed in gold, were the words, "The Empowered Voices Foundation." "You rose from the ashes he left you in," Min-sik said, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb grazing her lower lip. "You are my phoenix, Kalia. And this building is where you will teach others how to fly. It is already renovated. It is already yours. You can start tomorrow." Tears blurred Kalia's vision, hot and thick, but they weren't the tears of the girl who had been kicked in the rain. They were the tears of a woman who had been seen, understood, and finally empowered. She looked from the deed to the man standing before her, the king of the underground who had dismantled an empire to build her a sanctuary. "You did all of this while the gala was still happening?" she asked, a small watery laugh escaping her. "I told you," Min-sik whispered, leaning down to press his forehead against hers. "I have resources. And there is nothing in this city I won't move to see you smile." Kalia pulled him into a kiss, a deep, desperate declaration of everything she couldn't put into words. the gold lace of her dress pressed against his suit, the past and the present finally merging into a future that belonged entirely to her. She was no longer a footnote in someone else's story. She was the architect of her own, and as the morning sun began to peek over the Seoul skyline, Kalia knew that the girl Nathaniel had called trash was gone forever. In her place stood a queen, and her reign was only just beginning. The morning air in Itaewon was crisp, smelling of rain-washed stone and the faint, sweet scent of the cherry blossoms beginning to bloom along the Han River. A crowd had gathered in front of the historic 5-story building, a sea of cameras, journalists, and high-profile advocates for women's rights. But this time the flashbulbs didn't feel like a dizzying intrusion. They felt like witnesses to a rebirth. Kalia stood at the top of the stone steps, her hand resting lightly on the velvet ribbon that stretched across the grand entrance. She wasn't wearing the gold lace gown of the gala. Today she wore a tailored power suit in ivory silk, the lines sharp and the fit impeccable. It was a suit that commanded respect, a garment that didn't hide her but projected the woman she had become. Behind her, framed by the arched doorway, stood the staff of the Empowered Voices Foundation, legal experts, tech mentors, and counselors she had handpicked to ensure that no other woman in Seoul would ever have to feel the crushing weight of being trash. Min-sik stood a few paces back, leaning against one of the ivy-covered pillars. He was dressed in his signature dark suit, his presence as formidable as ever, but he remained in the background, a silent sentinel of shadow. He wasn't the face of the foundation. He was the iron that reinforced its walls. When their eyes met, he offered her a single slow nod of encouragement. He had given her the building and the resources, but he had let her build the soul of it herself. Kalia stepped forward toward the microphone, her voice clear and resonant, carrying over the hushed crowd. For a long time, she began, her gaze steady, I was told that my value was a gift given to me by others. I was told that without a specific name attached to mine, I was a charity case, a parasitic weight that deserved to be discarded when my usefulness was spent. She paused, and for a moment, the memory of the rain in New York and the cold marble of the Hyatt ballroom flickered in her mind. But the pain didn't bite anymore. It was just data. The Empowered Voices Foundation is not here to provide charity, Kalia continued, her chin tilting upward. It is here to provide justice. It is here to remind every woman who walks through these doors that her brilliance is her own, her future is her own, and no one, no matter how much wealth they wield, has the right to call her nothing. I was never a charity case. I was a survivor in wait. And today we make sure no one else has to wait alone. The crowd erupted into applause as Kalia took the silver shears and sliced through the ribbon. The silk fell away, and the doors to the sanctuary swung open. Later that afternoon, after the last of the dignitaries had left and the first 3 residents had been settled into their advocacy suites, Kalia retreated to her private office on the top floor. The room was bright, filled with the scent of white roses and the quiet hum of a high-tech workspace. She sat at her desk, looking out over the Seoul skyline, when her phone buzzed on the mahogany surface. It was an email from an unlisted address. Her heart didn't race. It didn't even skip a beat. She opened it with a calm, clinical curiosity. Kalia, the message began. The font was erratic, as if written in haste. I'm in a motel in New Jersey. My father's lawyers have stripped me of everything. I can't even get a job in a mailroom. Everyone knows. They see your face on the news and then they look at me like I'm a ghost. Kalia, please. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I didn't mean what I said. I was just stressed. I know you're happy now, but I have nothing. Not even enough for next week's rent. For the sake of what we had. Help me. Just this once. I'm a charity case now, Kalia. Please. Kalia read the words twice. She looked for the anger she thought she'd feel, the satisfaction of seeing him broken, or even a lingering spark of the old pity. But there was nothing. Nathaniel Crow was no longer a villain or a titan. He was just a series of desperate characters on a screen. He was a man who only acknowledged his cruelty when the consequences became uncomfortable. He had called her trash when she was at her lowest. He had stolen her brilliance to buy his own vanity. And now he wanted her to be the very thing he had mocked. A benefactor for someone who hadn't earned it. She heard the door open softly. Minsik walked in, his overcoat draped over his arm. He didn't ask to see the phone, but he saw the look on her face, the quiet, absolute finality of it. Is the past still trying to speak? He asked, his voice a low, protective rumble. Kalia looked up at him, the man who had seen her worth when she was still a ghost in her own life. She looked at the building around her, the lives she was about to change, and the empire of hope she had built on the ruins of her betrayal. No, Kalia said softly. The past is silent. She turned back to the screen. Her thumb hovered over the trash can icon. There was no need for a reply. No need for a final insult or a lecture on justice. Nathaniel didn't deserve her words, and he certainly didn't deserve her mercy. She tapped the icon, and the message vanished into the digital void. She then went to her settings and blocked the sender, the IP address, and any trace of the man who had tried to break her. He was deleted. Minsik reached her side, his hand resting on her shoulder, his thumb grazing the ivory silk of her suit. Are you ready to go home, my queen? Kalia stood, leaning into him, feeling the solid, unshakable reality of her present. She looked at her desk, where her own name was engraved on a gold nameplate. Kalia Sinclair, founder. Yes, she said, a brilliant, genuine smile finally touching her lips. Let's go home. As they walked out of the office and the lights dimmed behind them, the building stood tall in the soul night, a monument to the woman who had risen from the ashes. Marcus and Nathaniel were gone, relegated to the footnotes of a story that had outgrown them. Kalia Sinclair was no longer a case to be handled or a secret to be kept. She was the architect of her own destiny, and as she stepped into the elevator with the king by her side, she knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged.